Hi, I'm Alex.
And I'm Amy.
Our project is called Mind, Body, and Soul, the Nature of Well-Being, and this podcast is just one small piece of the overall project. We are making a documentary that follows our hike on the Continental Divide Trail that will explore how spending time in nature affects a person's mental, physical, and spiritual well-being.
We are guinea pigs in a sense because we will be documenting our own experiences and recording changes that we find. Along the way, we are interviewing people about their experiences in nature to see how they have been affected.
Much of the benefits that come from being in nature are subjective, and therefore hard to measure in a quantifiable way. That's why we have turned to recording stories as a way to distribute this knowledge. Since the beginning of human culture, we have compressed valuable information into stories, and that's how we have shared wisdom throughout the generations.
We hope that the stories we gathered during this project will help spread some of the wisdom that can be found in the wilderness. Episode 21, Part 2 of 3, an interview with Robin Henderson where we dive even deeper on life as a Zen hermit monk. If you haven't listened to Part 1 of our conversation with Robin, now's the time to hit pause and go back. You won't want to miss the beginning of his incredible story. In this second installment, we pick up right where we left off, diving deeper into Robin's journey as a Zen hermit monk. He also shares the powerful experience of spending 100 days straight in the wilderness, and the profound lessons that came with it. To learn more about Robin, we will leave a link in the description where you can find his blog.
All right, so let's get into 100 days. Like, what's the first day like out there once you realize what you're in for?
The first day is hell. The first day is hell, and then it kind of stays hell for a long time, especially when you start in May like I did, and it's freezing cold. Like most people that live indoors, I didn't realize that you go outside in the day in May, and it's fairly warm, but at midnight, it's like December. And I had very little in the way of equipment when I went out there. So my feet I've never had my feet that cold before in my life. And they just stayed that cold because I was wearing freaking sandals. I was a Buddhist monk out there wearing a robe and sandals. And it was here, and it was raining, and it was cold, and I was sleeping in this little backpacker tent in the middle of the jungle. And I remember this really, really well. I could not warm up my feet. And it would prevent me from sleeping. And I have a nice sleeping bag. I'd get in there and I'd pile all any clothes that I wasn't wearing, which wasn't many. And I'd get in there and my feet were just freezing. There was no snow, it was May, and I had never experienced that before. The impossibility of bathing in a situation like that because it's cold, and living off rice and beans and not much in the way of rice and beans. So every night I was starving hungry, and that went on for I remember the end of the first 2 weeks, because writing my journal, and I would write down what day it was. So it was the date and the day of the week, and this was day 1, day 2, day 3, and writing down day 14, and my first comment was, oh my God, I can't believe this is day 14. By day 14, I felt like I'd been out there for years, And part of it was the suffering, but a lot of it was just there was no distractions. So I was living every single second, and time just slows down. It doesn't do that when you're hiking, because when you're hiking and things are passing you. Try this sometime. I highly recommend it. Try sitting in one place for a day and see how long that day is. My God, it goes on forever. And one of the things about sitting 100 days in the woods, which people that haven't done it, including monastery monks, don't understand, is it's 100 years. I lived 100 years out there, and I'm not joking. Days were so long that I eventually figured out, I stopped worrying about anything, about having to get anything done. By about day 50, I'd figured out that these days go on forever. I've got forever to do this. And if I don't get it done today, then I will have this long night that goes forever, and the sun will come up, and I'll have another year tomorrow that I can do this. So you can probably guess by the way that I talk, this kind of pressured talk, I'm not much of a laid back guy, but out there, I got so laid back, I mean, I just couldn't worry about anything because time was dragging so slowly. And by the end of it, I loved that. I just loved the fact that nothing was important. Every second just goes for hours. So there's nothing for me to be uptight about. I came off the mountain, I was so mellowed out, people worried about me. Fortunately, being among human beings, again, I slowly started to, the pressure started to build again. But that's what I remember about Ango, was the first week was hell. I was living out in the woods, and there was a barn that the person who owned the acreage, who let me sit out there, he had a barn down below. And all of my supplies were down there. So I'd go down the mountain once a week and fill up on rice and beans and pickles and take my bath and whatever else. Take my bath. It was a coffee can full of water. And I remember I went down there at the end of the first week, and it was like the Hilton for me. I'd forgotten that I even owned shoes. And there were my shoes and socks. And I put those on, and it was like, oh my God, this is great. I didn't need to go back to town. That barn, which was a barn, was enough for me. It wasn't raining on me in there. It was great. It was awesome. And I'm glad that I had that experience. And to be perfectly honest with you, if I could swing a way to do it, I'd be doing it now for the rest of my life. It was brilliant. Although next time I'm going to build a hut. But aside from that, I would do that forever if I could do that forever.
It's so interesting how your perspective basically flipped at 180 of this is hell, is taking forever, to just perfectly appreciating that it's taking forever.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that process.
In my book, there's a line that I wrote about that first week where I talked about how my idea going out there was this was going to be a Zen summer camp. And I realized by day 4 or day 5 that what this was a Zen prison camp, and the warden was a bastard. Yeah, I was the guy who was setting the rules, and I was Scottish enough to determine that, by God, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to suffer like this, I'm going to get from it whatever there is to get. I'm not going to suffer for no reason, and that's a Zen teaching. Don't suffer for no reason. So if this is going to be this miserable, and I haven't even talked about the inner demons. I mean, they were even worse. But if this is going to be this miserable, then by God, I'm going to get out of it what there is to be got out of it, because there's no way out, and I'm bullying through this. I think that was a good attitude. By the time I got out of there, it was literally the most wonderful thing I've ever done in my life, and I've done a lot of wonderful things. That was the most amazing thing I've ever done.
So what did the inner demons do to you? What kind of thoughts and probably self-doubts and stuff?
Self-doubt, a lot of guilt and shame over my past. And it was hard for me being a person, I don't know why I'm like this, but I mentioned earlier I've always had this feeling that it's my job to fix what's wrong with the world. It's especially my job to fix the people around me that I love that have trouble. I'm supposed to do something about that. Why I'm that way, I don't know. I am the oldest child in my family, and they say that oldest children kind of are raised with this overweening sense of responsibility. I don't know, but part of it was fear for the people that I love and cared about, that I had abandoned to go out there, and I'm worried about it. People I love are getting hurt, they're getting sick, they need something from me, and I know darn well there's plenty of other people that can help them out. But that was an issue. There's a certain amount of guilt going out there doing that. And as I say, my past, just thinking about the damage that I incurred in my past. I have a marriage in my background that ended badly. And frankly, I don't feel a lot of guilt for it, because I do think it was mostly on her. This time it was mostly on her. But it still left me very damaged and very hurt. I went into that marriage saying, I'm doing this for the rest of my life. I'm going to be married to this person forever, for better or for worse, and that's how I viewed marriage. And when it fell apart, I felt a lot of guilt because it fell apart. And my wife was fairly hurtful to me in the last years, So there was a lot of that damage. There's this person that you trust a lot. When you marry somebody, you trust that person a lot. And if she turns out to be hurting you, that's difficult. Because you're wide open. She knows all your secrets. She knows everything about you. If she decides to hurt you, she knows how. And she did. So, and then I loved her. So there was the pain that I felt because she was in pain. This is the weird circles that empaths like me get into. The person hurting you is in pain. That's why they're hurting you, and you know that. So you feel sorry for them because they're in pain and they're using that to hurt you. So I've got a lot of this in my past, and a lot of those demons were bothering me. And I'm pleased to say that I put a lot of those demons to bed. They're still there. They still wake up sometimes, but thanks to Ango, I can live with them and I can have a conversation with them now, because that's what I did out there. I got so crazy out there. I would have conversations with people that weren't there. I would be sitting on the cushion meditating with my hands in mudra, and I would suddenly be right back to something that happened to me when I was 9. Some schoolmate of mine when I was 9, and I would start talking to this person on the cushion, and we would have a conversation out there. And eventually that voice in my head would say, "You've gone crazy again, Robin." And I'd go, "Oh, right, I'm here alone." And but after 60 days in the woods, you get a little weird. You've got nobody but yourself to acculturate you, and we're all a little weird, and I'm very weird. So I started to turn very strange out there, and I'm very, very thankful for my monastery training and for my many years of Zen training, that I was equipped not to become Tom Hanks in that movie where he talks to a volleyball. I love that movie, by the way. I adore that movie, and there's a lot in that movie that's very accurate. But I didn't get crazy the way that Tom did. I used to live down here on the coast, on the open coast down here. I was preparing dinner, and I was flipping through the TV channels because I was watching something while I was making dinner, and there was that church channel with the evangelical preachers, and I actually sat and listened to him, and he wasn't completely crazy. He was crazy about a lot of stuff, but a lot of what he was saying made sense. And before I was practicing Zen, I wouldn't have had the ability. I've had that experience many times now since I started practicing Zen, of listening to people that A, I don't want to listen to because I find them tedious and annoying, and B, I don't have any respect for their perspective. Might be a political speaker whose perspective I don't subscribe to. It might be a certain Zen teacher whose take on Zen I don't like, but I will set myself down and listen. And oftentimes I'm astonished how often I come away with heightened respect for that person and with useful information that I wouldn't have got before. So that's a definite change in my personality since I started practicing Zen, is I'm much more open than I was before.
Yeah.
I do try and do that too. Sometimes just listen to people
you do it a lot.
I don't like or don't agree with or anything.
Some people have a natural talent for that. I'm not one of them.
I think Alex has that talent.
I think it's something I practice a little bit, but I guess I'm just curious too.
Yeah, you're a very curious being.
You talked about being an empath, and people have told Amy that she's an empath too, and I've kind of gotten open or used to that idea and just kind of see how it affects people too. The way I understand it is that you can't help but absorb the energy around you, like whatever is being emitted.
Yeah.
You absorb it.
Yeah. My mom told me one time when we were talking about this, I was well into middle age when we had this conversation. I was talking about this thing which can be quite annoying, that I get. Well, let me just give you one example. When I was married, my wife and I were sitting up in bed reading, and there was a shelf above the bed, just right above our heads, which wasn't smart. And my wife bent over to do something, to arrange the covers or something, and then kind of threw herself back because she was going to lay down and sleep, and her head clipped that shelf. And I can still remember that sound, this bonk sound with full force, and she went, "Ow!" And my head hurt. and it hurt all night long, and the next morning her head was fine. She had a bit of a bump there. It didn't hurt anymore, but my head still hurt the next morning just because that had happened to her. And my mom told me when we were talking about this kind of thing, she said, you know, when you were a little baby, when you were an infant, I would lie you on your back, like in the crib, and if I looked over the edge of the crib and just frowned at you like this, you would start to cry. She said, and that was at a point where, as far as we know, babies don't even fully focus yet. You know, our eyes aren't really fully working yet at that point. Everything's a little blurry. And even at that, I could tell from the change of the shape of her face that she was angry or sad or something wasn't working, because I didn't have any language yet either. I could see that something wasn't working, and it would get into me and I'd start crying. And she said, you've always been like that. And that's what I mean when I say, when I was a child and a young man, I desperately needed mentorship. And what I was being told was stop being that way. And A, that doesn't work. And B, no, I'm supposed to be this way. The rest of you should be more like me in that sense. Maybe not in others, but in that sense. I needed mentorship for people to tell me. I was being told, this is the metaphor that I always use. I was given this massively powerful automobile, right? And I was being told either to shut the engine off and get out of the car or to brake instead of how to steer. And that's what I needed to learn. And I was never given that kind of mentorship, not because anybody was being mean to me, but I just don't think they knew what to do with me. Particularly American culture, and particularly if you're male in American culture, you're supposed to be a warrior. And the idea that tears come to your eyes when your gerbil dies, I mean, I'm not talking about 8 years old, I'm talking about 38. My gerbil ran this little ball off the deck of our house because I left the door open like a complete moron, and he died. He fell a story to the lawn below and died in my hand, and I cried like a baby, you know. And my sister's boyfriend was over, and I could tell by the look on his face that he did not know what to make of that, of a bearded, balding 38-year-old man, you know, bawling over this dead pet. But that's me. I've always been that. We went fishing. I could go on with stories and stories about this. I went fishing with my dad, who was an obsessive fisherman, and we caught a whole bunch of bluegill. And I wouldn't let him kill any of the fish, and we had to bring them home alive in a bucket. And my dad told me later, the whole time he's driving the car, thinking, well, what are we going to do with these fish when we get them home? Well, we had a wading pool out back there that us kids would wade around in. I was 6 at the time. And so he poured the fish into the wading pool, and still thinking, what has to happen is somehow we have to come up with a situation where Robin is not looking, where I can gut these fish and put them in the freezer. Not so much because he necessarily wanted so badly to eat them, but they had to do something with them. And that wasn't working out. And then he was thinking, yeah, but Robin's going to ask what happened to the fish, and I'm either going to have to lie or tell him, and either way it's not going to end well. So there was a creek about a mile behind our house, and he ended up catching all those fish with a net, putting them back in the bucket, and we had to drive to the creek, where I'm sure all these fish instantly died, but put them in that creek, because otherwise there would have been a scene. So I like I say, I've got story after story after story like this, and what I needed was adults who understood how my heart works, and I did not encounter that, and that was the problem.
I think that's a really good analogy of having a superpowered car and you're just being told to brake.
Right. You're being told that it's a disadvantage, that it's something wrong with you. It's not something that, and I didn't learn that until Zen. There's nothing wrong with me. It's just that people around me don't know what to do with me, which basically is their problem. And now it also means that I need to be wise about how I interact with other people, but I wasn't born wrong. And that was what Zen gave me almost immediately when I first started practicing Zen. Oh, you're just you. Okay. It's wrong when I hurt people. And I've done that in the past just from ignorance, you know. That's wrong. But when I'm not hurting somebody else, they just are uncomfortable around me, that's on you.
I think that just says something about our society and its kind of like narrow focus of like what's acceptable. And that does seem to be changing. There does seem to be like more room opening up for different kinds of people and different ways of thinking and stuff.
I hope so. I hope so. I mentioned this earlier that we've had in Western culture, and I think especially in the English-speaking cultures, we've had a problem with the different rates and directions of growth of the two genders. So that women, there's a feminist movement in the 60s, and then it led to all kinds of enlightenment from women about who they are and what they have a right to be and all that kind of thing. Men, for a variety of reasons, American men have remained very suppressed, very repressed. And I was just talking to my sister about this. When I was a kid, men were much more open with each other and physically demonstrative with each other. And a funny thing happened in the 1970s when it began to be all right to be gay, which was way overdue. I mean, that was thousands of years overdue. It got to be okay to be gay. Those of us that were not gay started to be terrified that someone would think we were. And the men in my dad's generation touched each other a lot more. They hugged a lot more than they do now, and they weren't nearly as uptight as men are now about what if somebody briefly thinks we're gay? What if some stranger we'll never see again walks by and wonders if perhaps we're gay? Men didn't think like that before the gay liberation movement. And it's weird how American men, it's not just Americans, there are a lot of countries that have this problem, where men are still kind of terrified. We're still kind of terrified to just go ahead and be ourselves, And we're raised, men are definitely raised to believe that we are creatures of duty. There is no doubt about that. We are raised to believe we are creatures of duty and we're expendable. And those are very dangerous thoughts for us to have. They don't make us happy. And ultimately, they don't make other people happy either.
It's an interesting side effect of gay rights finally coming to fruition.
Yeah, talk about it being like totally overdue. Yeah. But it's funny that now that we walk around and there's gay people everywhere. I have a lot of my close friends came out of the closet, and I found out that it's normal to be gay and there's gay people everywhere. When I was a kid, nobody ever talked to children about this at all. So by the time I hit adolescence, I didn't even know there were people who were attracted to people of the same gender. So what happened was I went to school and the kids on the playground were using these terms to insult one another. I didn't know what they meant. When I asked my mom, she explained to me. And I thought, that's a thing? So we didn't have any complexes as young people because basically we didn't know what was going on and we didn't know people like that were around you. And now that we do, straight men are often really complexed about that. About what if somebody, and they're not even homophobic men. That's the weird thing. It's not even the homophobes that are like that. It's all of us more or less are worried. And then I started practicing Zen one day and I realized, does it make a difference if somebody thinks I'm gay? Does it make a difference if I'm gay? No. So I put that down, but I have friends who still get on my case for quote unquote being gay about things. And I'm like, dude, what is this, 1953? You're not homophobic. What do you... I don't know.
Back to Anga, is that what you're
Ongo.
What is that, or where does that word come from?
Ongo is just it's a word. It's a Japanese word, and it might have come originally from Chinese. I don't know. It's a Japanese word that means withdrawing, and they do it in the monastery too. They just do it in the monastery. In the monastery it's usually 90 days. And a monk will be assigned Ongo by the teacher, and the monk will go on to sit Ongo for 90 days in the monastery.
Why 90 days? That's not as cool as 100.
I don't know. I don't know why it dropped down to 90 days. I do know that Japanese monasteries are on a 10-day cycle. So it's, I don't know, it's no more divisible by 10 than 100, and 100 is 10 tens. So I don't know. The answer is I have no idea.
Okay. So why did you choose nature, like total isolation in nature? Could you have done this anywhere?
I could have and would have if I'd had to. In fact, I'd like to. I'd like to do like an apartment ongo where I'm in an apartment in the middle of town. That'd be fun. I'd like to do a seafaring ongo. One of the things I've been in life as a sailor, and to get on and sit ongo formally on a boat in the ocean, a sailboat in the ocean. That'd be nice. But really, it was a no-brainer for me to go into the woods. In my life, getting me into the woods has never been the problem. It's getting me back out again. That's always been the problem. So none of my friends were the least bit surprised when I said, I'm going to go sit in the jungle for 100 days all by myself. And they'd say, yeah, well, what are you planning to do after that? That was their response. Have you had lunch? Nobody was surprised.
Is there something about nature that's different, special, that's more like conducive to this sort of a thing?
One, there's no people. I have a love-hate relationship with humanity. It's become less hate since I started practicing Zen, but since I was a child, when people were mean to me, boom, right out of the woods. Fortunately, I lived in rural areas all my life where that was possible. But so there was that. There's a definite sense of refuge for me. It's funny, I'm terrified of cougars, but I'd rather take my chances with them. Now, that's the truth. Cougars terrify me. I've had nightmares about cougars, but I would rather take my chances with them than live around too many people. I'm the classic example of someone who was alone in a crowd. I didn't feel lonely out in the woods, even in Ongo. I feel lonely around other people, and that is absolutely the truth. I miss other people when they're not around, but I also feel a sense of loneliness that is not something I feel in nature. I like the fact that nature is real. I've always had the sense that human preoccupations are kind of fake anyway. We kind of made that stuff up. Someone is upset because your shirt doesn't match your pants. Prove that to me using physics. You know what I'm saying? Get out your microscope and show me how on a microscopic level my shirt and my pants don't match. And I've thought that way since I was little. I've thought that way. So I like the realness of nature where the concerns are real concerns. I mean, you're talking about survival itself out here. The life forms out here are doing real work. And I like to be in a place where that's the case.
I've come to very similar conclusions, and I think part of my reason for going into nature is because in society and this civilization, it can be hard to determine what is real, because there are real things here, but there's also a lot of not real things. And in nature, it becomes very clear what is real.
Yeah, trying to tell the difference between what's real and what's not real in the red dust world, which is the Zen term for the human world, is difficult. You don't have that problem in nature because everything is real. There aren't any liars in nature, There aren't any employers in nature. I mean, I suppose there are if you're an aphid living in an anthill, and who knows how they feel about that. But generally speaking, I just don't have the contempt for nature that I sometimes have for humanity, to be perfectly honest.
Have you found that being in the realness of nature, does that make it easier to determine what's real in civilization?
Yes, absolutely it does. Yep. And it makes me a little harder to get along with in some ways. It makes it harder to lay certain trips on me because I know what it feels like to have your feet be freezing cold for literally weeks at a time and not be able to do anything about it. And now you're upset with me because I used a term that you don't like. I feel that. I understand that. But especially if it's someone who knows me well enough to know better, I'm like, get over it. Let me take you out to this jungle that I slept in for 100 days, and we'll see how you feel about it on day 14.
Another thing I wanted to get back to was you talked about kind of sitting with your demons and just having a conversation with them. And another person that I interviewed used that exact same terminology. He said, now I can sit and have coffee with my demons and we just talk about stuff. And I found that when two people talk about something in the exact same way, there's something pretty real there.
Yeah.
What was that? How did that relationship develop with your demons over time?
Well, you know, one thing that I didn't mention that absolutely needs to be mentioned is that the past was a constant companion to me out there. There was a lot of working over my past, and it even became a formal practice by about the midpoint. I had a formal technique that I used where I sat down and I said, now I will confront the past, and I confronted a specific year every day until the end of Ongo. And that involved a lot of having to remember things going back to when I was a baby that I had to remember. And so I developed techniques for that, and it was kind of exhilarating in a lot of ways. But what ended up happening was I ended up reliving my life year by year right up to, you know, that moment. And I was revisiting a lot of the people that I knew there. And that very didactic process of going through all of my memories, like here's a reference you don't get, but a card catalog. We used to have those. Maybe you've seen them in pictures or perhaps museums. It was like shuffling through a Rolodex. I'm hitting you with a lot of challenging concepts here. But what would happen is that by the time I landed on the year I was, say, 13, okay, and I have a lot of these regrets and stuff from my adolescence. Everybody does. I think that's part of being an adolescent. But having already for the last week been a baby and a small child before I got there, things started to fall into place much more smoothly. I started to see myself as a person who was 13, having been 12 yesterday. Tomorrow will be 14. You know, and I could see how things were kind of fitting together. So the conversations I was having with the people that I knew were a lot less disjointed. And I could kind of understand now why I either got used by this person that way or used this person the way that I did. Either way, I regretted the experience, and I was able to apologize. I cried a lot out there. I was apologizing to people who weren't there, but I was apologizing to them for things that I had done. I was apologizing to them for resenting them. That was another thing I ended up doing. You know, apologizing for all the resentment that I'd felt and realizing I had no business feeling resentment. Okay, this person hurt me, but they were screaming in the same dark room I was. You know, they were being me. How dare they? You know, stop that immediately. Nobody knows better than I am what a bad thing it is to be me. So there was a lot of forgiveness going on. Forgiveness of me, forgiveness of them, forgiveness of life itself. You know, forgiveness of existence that I had to do. And that just, by the time I left, that had just become addictive. Forgiveness had become addictive. I was just forgiving everything in sight. And I was loving everything that I saw. I got ridiculous. I mean, thank God nobody was there to see me. Another story, very close to the end, I had a shaving mirror that I used to shave my head and my face. It was the only device I had that I could see myself in. And I learned by about the second week that I needed to check myself out in the mirror all the time because I was starting to look crazy. My face would get dirty and I didn't know it, and my eyes, I just looked like this wild man. So one of the Zen practices I had was at a certain time of day, I looked in this tiny mirror and looked at my face and adjusted so I wouldn't look crazy. But that mirror was a dear friend of mine that I used to shave in every week and to check myself out in, and I accidentally broke it a couple of days short of the end of Ongo, and I was devastated. And I remember holding this broken mirror in my hand and apologizing to it, and I had it all bandaged up with adhesive tape because I didn't have any other mirror to shave in, and I still had a couple of shavings that I had to do, and I just felt terrible that this mirror wasn't going to come out alive with the rest of us. And the rest of us were me and my tent and my backpacking stove and the rice I was eating. And then there were all the people that weren't going to follow me out, the millipedes and the elk and the coyotes that I lived among, which I'd never done that before. And they're a challenging peer group. And, I was in love with the trees out there. You hear right-wingers call environmentalists tree huggers? I did it. I did that. I bowed to trees. There was certain ancient trees on this acreage that I was living on that I would bow to in true Zen form with my bald head, with my bald monk head, and my sandals and my robe. So I already looked like a crazy man without bowing to trees. But I still have a deep sense of brotherhood with these trees out there. And that all happened from the past practice that I was doing of this long period of understanding, insight, forgiving, loving. And I came off the mountain loving everybody I knew so much that I was like a drunk. When I got off there, I was emailing all of my friends and telling them how much I loved them. And they would say, Rob, have you been drinking? I mean, you haven't been a drinker before. Is this a problem? And I said, no, I'm just on an ango high. It'll go away. But I came off loving everything. I came off the mountain loving everything in a way that was exhilarating, quite frankly. It was like a drug.
Do you think that that's something that would happen naturally to anybody, or was that something that you cultivated on purpose?
I think if you don't have Zen or some similar practice under your belt when you go out there, you'll go nuts. And it's not hard for me to believe a person even killing himself in that situation, because you've got nobody to live with but yourself, and it's hard. And if you don't have some kind of training and experience to put that in context, I would be very afraid for anyone who did that. And I should mention, I had good friends who came out at regular intervals to make sure that I was still alive, that there wasn't something I needed that I didn't have. It was called proof of life. And I had several friends. I had the friend who dropped me off, who was a fellow Zen hermit. I had the friend who picked me up. And I had friends who came out in the middle to see me, to assure my mother that I was still alive, and to make sure that there wasn't something I desperately needed I didn't have, and that kind of thing. And I would be delighted to be that person for someone else doing it, because I know how golden it is,
Like when I ran into people who were angry or unsatisfied with their life or something like that, I would say like, oh, they need to go out into the woods.
Yeah. For a day, maybe.
I thought that that's all that it would take.
For a day or a week, but 100 straight days all by yourself requires more.
Yeah, that's what I'm starting to realize now, is that it's not just about being out here. It's very much about the way that you treat your mind, I guess.
And the people taking care of you have got to be the kind of people that aren't going to try to talk you out of it. That's another thing. They need to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it and how it works, because a lot of people told me when I told them I wanted to do this, they tried to talk me out of it. And some of them didn't do it for necessarily altruistic reasons, like my Zen teacher, but some of them did it because they care about me and they didn't want grief to come to me, and they're not wrong. It's dangerous. What I did was dangerous. And I would really love to be the support person for another person doing this, because A, I know how to do it now. I've been out there. I know what the challenges are, so I know what they need. And B, I revere that. I understand how important it is and how what a good thing it is if you do it right. But that's a big if. But if you do it right, I feel like I'm qualified to be that guy, to be the point man.
Seems to me like there's probably a million ways to do it wrong and very few ways to do it right.
Yeah, and I did it wrong. I can tell you what I did wrong. I mean, everybody does it wrong. Like I was telling Amy when you were not present, I was telling her that I didn't come prepared in terms of sleeping. I got 1 or 2 decent nights of sleep out there because I slept on a pile of straw at one point, and that helped. But I was telling Amy, I'm not 20 anymore. I can't sleep on the hard ground like that for 100 straight days. And I learned that out there. And sleeping in that little backpacking tent was not the best plan. My thinking was, I'll be part of nature and never out of nature, and I'll just always be in the world. What I learned was sometimes you need some retreat, even if it's just a wall tent. You need something you can stand up in, especially in this climate, where you're in the rain all the time. So stuff like that. And there are things that I would definitely do different now. But I think the basic plan that I had going out there, owing to the research I did before I went out there, was the angle was fundamentally valid. And then there were the things that I learned. I went out there to learn those things too. That's why I wrote a book about this, is I want to encourage people that want to do this and have the same drive I did to do it. And my book is partly a narrative manual on how to do this. And so you're going to get to see a lot of things that I did wrong in the book. And my hope is that someone like me, because when I came up with the idea, a lot of people, especially within Zen, a lot of people tried to talk me out of it and tell me what I was doing was foolish or wrong or even evil, And so I want to get my book out there so that people that have the same impulse I have will hear there's none of those things. It's not foolish, wrong, or evil. You got to do it right. You do have to do it right. But it's a great thing to do. It's a good thing to do. If you're the person who needs that, it's a good thing to do.
Do you think anybody could do it with the right guidance?
I think anyone who is motivated to do it could do it. Having had a little background in the Quaker movement, the Quakers inadvertently came up with all of the forms of, or many of the forms of torture that are used against prisoners today, because they misunderstood one of their teachings, that Quakers, like Zeners, believe in quiet solitude. Quiet solitude is a great thing, but if you don't carry yourself to do it, it's torture. So the Quakers were very involved in the 19th century with the development of the modern prison system in this country. And they did it for all the right reasons, because they wanted, prisons have always been awful. They're still awful, sadly. But in the 19th century, they were even more awful. And the Quakers wanted to kind of move in there and turn prisons into something that weren't terribly inhumane. So what they did was, as Quakers, they knew that one of the ways to overcome damaged past is quiet solitude and self-reflection. So they came up with this plan. We'll lock prisoners in a room by themselves until they're fixed. Boy, does that not work. And I want to give full credit to the Quakers. If you ask any Quakers today, they will instantly tell you, boy, was that a bad idea. You have to want to do it. You have to go into the room and close the door. You can't just grab anybody and throw him in there and wait for him to heal himself, So same thing with Ango. If a person isn't motivated to do it and properly prepared in advance, just taking them out there in a helicopter and dropping them into the woods, I start to tremble thinking about it. That's not something you want to do. That's Australia. That's the history of Australia. That's what they were trying to do there, is just throw all those people into this big empty continent, and it'll work out. Well, I guess it did work out for the ones who survived, but it wasn't a good plan. Ask any Australian.
Yeah. I see something similar with like drug addictions and stuff like that. Those people don't get better unless they want to. And a lot of times they don't want to.
Yeah, you have to be motivated. You have to decide you want to stop doing drugs. With me, my drug was always, I'm trying to come up with a way to say this that doesn't sound Neanderthal. Well, the Neanderthal way to say it is women. But I don't mean women, I mean me. You understand? My relationships with women were like drugs for me. And I realized at a certain point, after a certain amount of Zen, it's exactly what you said. I realized that the reason why it was taking me 10 years to get over a breakup, and why I was just completely, ripped apart by this, and some of these relationships had lasted 30 days. It was crazy. And it was just like you said, with the help of Zen, I realized, Rob, the problem is you don't want to get over this. You know, you're clinging to this relationship that she left a long time ago and is off doing something else, and it's 10 years later, and you need to just decide not to be one of those Japanese soldiers in the South Pacific still fighting the Second World War 30 years later, because that's what I was doing. You know, you need to say to yourself, I don't want to be stuck on this person anymore. I don't want to be in this place. And it's astonishing how effective that is once you do that. But it took me a lot of insight to understand that I was clinging to this thing. And then, of course, the next insight is I was clinging, looking to get things I wasn't going to get from anybody, because that's not how you do, that's not how you do relationships. Let me tell you, that doesn't work. Women do not heal you. If you're a woman, men do not heal you. If you're gay, someone of your gender doesn't heal you. You know, that's not how that works. Those poor women. And as I told you, as I started practicing Zen, and I started to you know, find those women and apologize. And some of them were not good people, but most of them were great people. And I just needed to not be the ex-boyfriend from hell anymore, which I am not now. I am pleased to report.
Did you have a routine while you were out there?
Yes.
Every day kind of different?
No, it was a basically I set up a monastery in the woods, which I was fortunately qualified to do because I'd been inside. So I just set myself up on a monastic schedule, and I learned, interestingly, that a lot of the things that you do in Zen monasteries are crazy places. Everything is choreographed in a Zen monastery. When you're eating, when you all sit down to eat, every bit of that meal is choreographed from the start to the end. And it goes click, 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 click to the end. And that's called oryoki. The meal ritual is called oryoki. It's a wonderful ritual, by the way. It's great. And I set myself on oryoki out in the woods, and I learned that the reason why oryoki exists is not because you need it in the monastery. You don't particularly need it in the monastery. It has certain advantages, but it's not required. When you're sitting on the ground, and your food is on the ground, and your stove is in front of you, and you're eating like that, if you don't have a very carefully thought out ritual for eating, disaster ensues immediately. Dirt gets in your food. The first thing I did out there was dump a bowl of hot tea all over myself, which was a problem on multiple levels because I've got one change of clothes and all this other kind of thing. But I quickly learned that I needed oryoki out there. And then defecation, using the bathroom, was another oryoki that I had, where the whole thing was this whole dance you went through, and I learned to do that in the monastery. So that if you don't do that, you don't have limitless fresh water to clean up with and stuff. You know, human feces are dangerous out there, so you have to deal with them a certain way, and I learned to do that. Bathing was another oryoki. But by the time I left there, I was the Zen monk from hell. I didn't do anything without there be a ritual for it. I was following rituals in my dreams. You know, first we fall asleep, and then we start this kind of a dream, and then at a certain point that dream's over, so we move on to this. It was a kind of insanity, but it was also very nourishing. It was very nourishing, and that's where I learned why people in the monastery are like that, because they were originally hermits. Don't tell them that. They'll say, no, hermits are crazy. No, the reason why you guys in the monastery do those crazy things, and I'm not kidding, every minute, every second of every day is choreographed in the monastery. It'll drive you nuts. But the reason for that is because it was set up by hermits, and hermits knew as they came out of the woods that everything has to be done in a certain way, because out in nature things fall apart fast. You know, you can't be dirty out there. It's life-threatening, you know, if you don't have proper hygiene. And everything's trying to make you dirty out there. So you're learning how not to be dirty. And how not to get yourself into dangerous positions and all that kind of thing. How to wash things the most effective way possible when you've got a 5-gallon bucket and river water. You know, and that's what you've got to do it. There's a whole ritual that'll get it done much faster and much better. And that's why in the monastery you go through this whole ritual to wash your clothes in a washing machine. It makes no sense there, but they're doing it because their ancestors were crazy hermits like me that had these values, you know.
So do you think in the monastery they've forgotten why they're even doing it?
Oh, they've totally forgotten why they've even doing it. And in my book I talk about this, you know. I came off the mountain going, this is why you're crazy, because you're us. The monastery has invented, and I'm not being cute when I say this at all, the monastery is an invented forest. They have an indoor forest in there, and they go to great lengths to mock up the forest experience in the monastery. And they have long forgotten that that's what they're doing. They think they're just doing it because in Zen it's good to be mindful and have control of your thoughts, and the way you do that is by having all these crazy rituals. Okay, that's not wrong, but they learned that in the woods. They learned that in the woods by learning that first you have to keep your robe clean. And then after you have all these crazy rituals that are designed to keep your robe clean, that leads to insight and mental progress. That's where they learned that. And that's why you have this, in my book I call it an IKEA forest. The monastery is the IKEA forest. It's the forest you move indoors and put together. And all of that is designed to replicate what naturally happens to you in the woods.
That's really interesting. I've kind of gone through similar realizations, I guess, by spending time in nature. Because I feel like there's like a progression of like learning that you do throughout your life. In society and civilization, we kind of start here almost in the middle. Like people just tell you you're supposed to do these things, but nobody tells you why, and then you can kind of grow from there. But by going into nature, you get down here to like the foundational level, and you realize like this is why you do what you do, and then you can grow from there.
Why is not a question we ask outdoors. Why is obvious. You know you have to build a fire because it's cold and you're dying. Nobody has to sell you that, you know. But like you say, in the world of people have to sell you the reason for doing things. And in the monastery, you'll often ask or grumble about something that you have to do this ritual way. And the elders are always telling you, well, you just keep doing it, it'll make sense eventually. That is not wrong again, but it's not right either. I think that rituals that are imposed on others are suspect. I told you about my bowing to tree rituals out on the back and bowing to all kinds of things. And I had all kinds of, here's a ritual that I picked up on Ongo that I still do. It's called the handed ritual. Everything starts on the left where your heart is, because all things start in the heart, and everything finishes on the right, which I call this the heart hand, and this is called the road hand, or sometimes the world hand. And I had my whole life out there was structured that way, and I still live that way. I put on the heart shoe first, and then the road shoe. And at night I take off the road shoe first, and then the heart shoe. I keep my heart in the game till the last minute. It's the first thing that enters the game in the morning, and the last thing that leaves the game at night. And when I had my meal orioki at Ongo, everything started on this side. The food all came from this side. It was eaten. As bowls were emptied, they were shifted to the roadside. So I ended up with all the things I needed to eat on this side, and when I was done with the meal, they were all on this side. And the pockets on my pants, I was wearing army pants with cargo pockets. So the dirty stuff was all on the roadside. The toilet paper, the things I blew my nose on, the hand sanitizer, the things that I handled while dirty were always on the roadside. The things that were not dirty were always on the hard side. And I do everything that way still. But if I were to start a monastery and make everybody else do that, that would be crazy, because it has no meaning for them. And I would probably tell them the same thing that they tell you in the monastery now. I say, well, just do it and it'll eventually have meaning for you. That's probably true. It would eventually have meaning, but I'm not sure the meaning is really legitimate in that situation. So I've become a great believer in rituals that I see some reason for, and not so much a believer in rituals that you're being told to do by an authority figure who may be using the ritual to control you.
I think that was one of the things that really drew me to just being out in the wilderness, was that you decide what you do, and it all comes from decisions that you make, and it all comes from like really kind of foundational principles. And yeah, you don't have to do things a certain way because somebody tells you to.
You're never worried that maybe you're being taken advantage of. You're never worried that maybe somebody is deluding you somehow, except for yourself, of course. You're deluding the heck out of yourself, but nobody else. You're not working for somebody else's undeclared benefit, you know, and that's important. That's important. And there have been some cases, again, in the Zen establishment where monasteries have been dinged pretty hard for what is effectively slave labor. They've had the Sangha, the monks in the monastery, have been ordered to work without pay. There was a famous case in California where the state of California got involved and said, you can't do that. You can't have people work around the clock like this for profit-making ventures and not pay them. And the monastery in question said, well, it's our Zen tradition. It's religious. It's part of our religious rites. And the courts in California said, we don't think so. You've crossed the line. And I think they're right too. I agree.
I don't know if you're doing this on purpose or not, but I'm starting to see the monasteries almost as a metaphor for a lot of things that happen in society in general.
yeah, the monastery, and I want to say that's the strength of the monastery. The strength of the monastery is they throw you in with all these people that you can't get away from. They're all really annoying. And there's a Zen saying that the monks in a monastery are like pebbles in a bag. They work each other smooth. And that's very true. Some of the most annoying experiences you'll ever have with other people are in that monastery where you cannot get away from them. And everybody in a monastery has a rank. It's just like the army. So the people that outrank you, which is everybody at first, are really annoying. And then you reach a certain level where, now the way that monasteries work is that even after you leave, you're still a ranking student there. Once you come in, the meter keeps ticking. So if I were to go back to the monastery today, that same monastery, I'd be basically almost in charge. Me and the others of my same level. But then there's dealing with the other students of your own level of authority, where you can't solve problems either by ordering them to do something or getting somebody else. Now you aren't happy with how they're doing it. You're not being a student of our level properly. So that's another issue, and it's just a very human thing. And I do believe that deep wisdom can come from that. I've got good friends that are devout monastery monks who would never have it any other way. They're great people, and I'm absolutely certain that the monastery is doing great things for them, and there is no other way for them. I could see myself as a monastery monk under certain circumstances. I'm not at all opposed to the monastery. But even when I was in the monastery, to be perfectly honest with you, I was a hermit. I went into the monastery when I'd already been a hermit, and I viewed myself as a hermit doing something different when I was in the monastery. So that unlike some of the students who had to leave when we had the problems with the teacher, that was kind of hard for them. It was kind of devastating for them. It was difficult for me too, because you have a very close relationship with your teacher. It's a parental relationship. So it was very difficult for me too, but I was luckier than my fellow students because I had something to go back to. My attitude when I left the house was, well, I'll just go back to my hermit practice. That was working great before I went into the monastery. In some ways, my monastery practice didn't work as good as my hermit practice. There were things that I missed inside. So for me, there was this sense of, all right, now I'm doing this thing again. And it wasn't as devastating as it can be for people that don't have an alternative. I think it drove my teacher nuts too. In fact, she almost told me a couple of times that she could tell by the look in my eyes that I was still practicing outside the monastery, outside the Zen center, when I was still there. She could tell. She could tell by the way that I obeyed orders, which is to say I always obeyed orders. I had great respect for the Zen establishment and the Zen tradition. It's 1,000 years old. I have great respect for that. So I would never think to not follow an order or to roll my eyes or anything like that. But she could just kind of tell by the way that I turned to obey, that I had decided to turn to obey. And she wasn't wrong. You know, and she said, you have to do this way. She could see that there was a quick conversation behind my ears going, are we going to do it that way? Yeah. She could tell that that's how that was going, that there was a middleman and it was me, you know. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of the monastery, but I don't think the monastery is always such a great fan of me.
Because you're a thinking individual? Is that...
You know, it isn't even that. It's not that the other monks aren't thinking. That isn't the thing. Like I said, most of the senior monks left that place, and I was the only hermit among them. So they had something else going on that was powerful, you know, that wasn't evident when they bowed. There was something in their face that didn't say, I have now decided to bow. Next time I may not, right? Whatever they had, though, was very authentic, very Zen. Their Zen was very good, so that when things weren't Zen, and it looked like they weren't going to become Zen, they did the same thing I did. But their strength and their insight just came from a different path, a different practice. I think there's a tremendous future there. The first thing that needs to be said is that Western Zen is much different from the Zen of Asia. And that's been true from the beginning. And within Western Zen, there's a lot of tension over that fact.
That wraps up part 2 of our conversation with Robin Henderson. We ended up talking for another hour, so stay tuned. Part 3 is coming next, and you won't want to miss it. And don't forget, to learn more about Robin, we will leave a link in the description.
If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe, where you'll find a lot of videos that have similar themes.